I'd sooner wed a prize heifer. She's too fat for church doors. He said it to make another woman laugh. She heard every word. 6 months later, as Grand Duchess, she made him beg. The spring of 1816 descended upon London with a perfume thick enough to choke on. For Miss Adeline Blackwood, it was the season that would teach her the difference between being seen and being displayed. At 22, Adeline was already dangerously close to becoming what the ton whispered about in drawing-rooms, a cautionary tale, a wasted dowry, a woman who simply took up too much space. If this story has already drawn you in, if you feel the weight of unspoken longing and the promise of what is yet to come, then pause just a moment. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who loves stories where hearts are tested and destinies are rewritten. We publish new tales every day, each one richer, deeper, and more unforgettable than the last. Tell us where you're from in the comments, because I would like to connect with you all, my friends. Stay with us, because the best moments are always still ahead. As the eldest daughter of Baron Blackwood, she possessed a bloodline that should have secured a respectable match and an inheritance that could have funded a gentleman's country estate. But Adeline committed 2 unforgivable transgressions in the eyes of Regency society. First, she possessed a mind that could calculate compound interest faster than any gentleman's banker, and a tongue that refused to simper. Second, and perhaps more damning in a world that worshipped the waif-like and the willowy, Adeline was a woman of substance. She had curves where fashion dictated straight lines, and a presence that no amount of whalebone corseting could compress into fashionable fragility. She had learned to navigate the assembly rooms with a guarded heart, accepting her role as the overlooked eldest daughter with quiet dignity, until Lord Charles Stanhope looked her way. Charles was a viscount with golden curls that caught the candlelight and a smile that felt dangerously genuine. He had not looked past her, he had looked at her. He had engaged her in discussions about estate management and agricultural reform, ignoring the tittering debutantes to seek her counsel near the card-room. He had made her believe, foolish woman that she was, that he saw the sharp intellect beneath the emerald silk, that he valued the substantial mind over the slender waist. She had allowed herself a dangerous luxury, hope. It happened at Almack's assembly rooms, amidst the swirl of muslins and the cloying scent of rosewater and desperation. Seeking a moment's respite from the suffocating heat and her mother's pinching fingers adjusting her stays, Adeline had stepped behind a towering floral arrangement near the refreshment alcove. She had intended to catch her breath, perhaps to compose herself before Charles claimed the supper dance he had requested earlier that evening. Instead, she heard his voice, rich with brandy-soaked amusement, carrying clearly over the orchestra's minuet. "Marry Adeline Blackwood? Good God, man, have you seen the size of her? I'd sooner wed a prize heifer. She's too fat to fit through the church doors, let alone grace a marriage bed." The masculine laughter that followed was sharp, surgical in its precision. Adeline stood there frozen behind the lilies and house roses, her gloved hand hovering inches from the blooms, the blood draining from her face until she felt as pale as the white petals that mocked her with their delicate perfection. "But you've spent half the season dancing attendance on her," another voice interjected, confusion lacing the words. "We thought you were courting her in earnest." "Courting?" Charles laughed was cruel in its casualness. "I was bored. She's tolerable for conversation when one needs a respite from insipid debutantes. But marry her? Heavens no. A man wants a wife to adorn his arm, not debate his decisions. Besides, she's far too substantial. One prefers a delicate bloom, not a hedge in full flower." The laughter that erupted was not just mockery, it was agreement, collective, comfortable agreement. Adeline did not gasp, she did not faint. She stood there among the flowers meant to beautify the room, while the heat of humiliation crawled up her neck like a living thing. The betrayal was not just in his words, but in the devastating realization of her own naivete. She had mistaken his interest for attraction, his amusement for affection, his cruelty for connection. She took one slow, steadying breath, then another. She did not step out to confront him. She would not grant him the satisfaction of her tears or the spectacle of her anger. Instead, Adeline turned with perfect deportment and walked toward the side entrance, her head held at the exact angle her governess had drilled into her since childhood. She signaled for her carriage before the supper dance was even announced, leaving behind the music, the mockery, and the last remnants of her illusions. The April air outside was damp and biting, pressing against her flushed cheeks like a cold compress. But as the carriage door closed behind her, shutting out Almac's golden glow and cutting laughter, Adeline realized something with crystalline clarity. The chill of the London night was nothing compared to the ice that had just formed around her heart. Lord Charles Stanhope had not broken her, he had frozen her, and in that freezing she hardened. She would become unmeltable. Upon returning to Blackwood House, the silence of the marble entrance hall felt less like sanctuary and more like a mausoleum. Adeline dismissed her lady's maid, insisting on unlacing her own gown, her fingers working the hooks with a violence that bordered on desperation. When the emerald silk finally pooled at her feet like spilled wine, she did not step away. She stood before the full-length cheval mirror in her chemise and stays, forcing herself to look, really look. The reflection staring back was not the fashion of 1816. This was the season of the sylph, the spectral, the consumptive. Women were expected to be decorative and slight, porcelain figurines that might shatter if embraced too firmly. Adeline was not porcelain. She was granite. She possessed a beauty that belonged in a Renaissance painting, not a Regency ballroom. A figure of lush curves and undeniable presence that refused to be compressed into the fashionable tube silhouette of the Empire waist. Too much, her mother, Lady Beatrice, had lamented countless times, watching the modiste struggle to cinch the corset tighter. You are simply too much, Adeline, too much bosom, too much opinion, too much self. Men do not want a challenge, my dear. They want comfort. For years those words had been the chorus of her existence. Adeline had tried to shrink. She had survived on weak tea and toast for weeks before each season began, trying to starve away the fullness of her hips. She had bitten her tongue bloody to avoid correcting a gentleman's Latin or outpacing him in political discourse. She had dimmed the brightness of her mind so that the fragile egos around her might shine undimmed. And for what? To be mocked in a public assembly by the one man she had allowed herself to trust? To be reduced to livestock in a comparison about carriage capacity? The humiliation burned, not because it was novel, but because it confirmed the terrifying suspicion she had carried since her debut, that she was fundamentally unlovable in this world of shallow surfaces. She walked to her writing desk and picked up the stack of invitation cards that littered its surface. Lady Pemberton's musical, the Duchess of Devonshire's garden party, Lord and Lady Ashford's country ball. She would attend none of them. But as she let the gilt-edged cards fall through her fingers like autumn leaves, one invitation caught her eye. Heavy vellum, sealed with black wax, bearing a crest she did not recognize. It had arrived that morning, addressed in a bold, masculine hand. Miss Adeline Blackwood, I am in need of a wife of substance, intelligence, and presence to manage the considerable affairs of my estate. If you find yourself unappreciated in London, I invite you to consider a union based on mutual benefit rather than shallow affection. I do not require a decorative ornament. I require a partner. Nicholas Hargrave, Grand Duke of Oakhaven. Adeline read the letter once, then twice. Then she walked to her desk, pulled out a sheet of writing paper, and dipped her pen in ink. Her hand did not tremble as she wrote her acceptance. The morning after Almack's, Adeline woke to find her mother already in her bedchamber, a new gown draped across her arms like a sacrificial offering. Lady Beatrice Blackwood stood by the window, her silhouette sharp against the grey London light, and Adeline knew immediately that this was not a social call. This was an intervention. "Get up," her mother said, her voice carrying that particular blend of disappointment and determination that Adeline had learned to dread. "We have 3 days until the Pemberton Gala, and you will fit into this gown if I have to lace you myself until you faint." The dress was beautiful in the way that cruelty could be beautiful. Pale rose silk that shimmered like dawn, with a waist so narrow it might have been designed for a child. Adeline looked at it and felt something cold settle in her chest. She had seen this pattern before. Her mother had commissioned it weeks ago, back when Lord Charles was still pretending affection, back when Adeline still believed she could shrink herself into something lovable. "I'm not going to the Pemberton Gala," Adeline said quietly, pulling the coverlet higher. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, hollow and distant, as though it belonged to someone else. Lady Beatrice's laugh was sharp as cut glass. "Don't be ridiculous. Everyone who matters will be there. This is your chance to salvage what's left of your reputation after last night's little display." "My display?" The words came out sharper than Adeline intended. "I wasn't the one who made a spectacle, Mother. I simply left when I realized I wasn't welcome." "You fled like a coward," her mother corrected, moving closer to the bed. "Half the room noticed your absence before supper was served. Do you know what they're saying? That you ran home crying because Lord Stanhope danced with Lady Henrietta, that you cannot handle the smallest disappointment, that you are too sensitive, too emotional, too fat." Adeline finished, her voice flat. "Is that the word you're looking for, Mother? Too fat?" The silence that followed was electric. Lady Beatrice's mouth thinned into a bloodless line, and for a moment Adeline thought her mother might actually strike her. Instead, she lifted the rose silk gown higher as if it were evidence in a trial. "Try it on," she commanded. "Now." Adeline rose from the bed slowly, her bare feet cold against the floorboards. She had performed this ritual 100 times before. The stripping away of her nightdress, the chemise pulled tight, the corset brought out like an instrument of torture. Her mother's maid, Sarah, stood in the corner with her eyes downcast, holding the whalebone stays that would compress Adeline's ribs until breathing became a luxury. But this morning something was different. This morning Adeline could still hear Lord Charles's voice echoing in her skull, could still feel the weight of that laughter pressing down on her chest. This morning she had already been reduced to livestock in a public assembly. What more could a corset do to her that hadn't already been done? She stepped into the gown without the stays, letting the silk pool around her natural waist. The fabric strained immediately, pulling tight across her hips, gaping at the bodice, where her actual body refused to disappear into the dress's fantasy of her. "The corset, Adeline," her mother said through gritted teeth. "No." The word hung in the air like a blasphemy. Sarah actually gasped. Lady Beatrice's face flushed deep red, the colour creeping up her neck in blotches. "You will put on the corset, and you will let Sarah lace you properly, and you will fit into this gown. Do you understand me? You will stop being so stubborn and difficult, and you will—" Something inside Adeline snapped. She felt it physically, like a rope pulled too taut finally giving way. She reached down, grabbed the delicate rose silk bunched around her thighs, and pulled. The sound of ripping fabric was obscenely loud in the quiet bedchamber, a tearing that seemed to go on as she rent the gown from hem to bodice, splitting it down the center until it hung from her shoulders in ruined shreds. Her mother stood frozen, mouth open, as Adeline let the destroyed silk fall to the floor in a whisper of expensive ruin. "I am done shrinking," Adeline said, and her voice no longer sounded hollow. It sounded like iron. I am done starving myself and lacing myself and apologizing for existing in a body that takes up space. I am done pretending that if I just compress myself enough, someone will finally find me acceptable. She stepped over the ruined gown, walked to her writing desk, and picked up the letter that had been waiting there since yesterday. Heavy vellum, black wax, the Grand Duke of Oakhaven's proposal. "I'm leaving London," she said, not looking at her mother, "and I'm never coming back." The letter had arrived 3 days before Almack's, slipped between invitations to garden parties and notices from dressmakers. Adeline had almost discarded it, mistaking the heavy black wax for a funeral announcement. Only the unfamiliar crest had made her pause, a raven perched on a crown of oak leaves, stark and somehow threatening against the cream vellum. She had read it standing by her bedroom window, the morning light making the bold handwriting look almost violent against the page. There had been no preamble, no courtly flattery, no mention of her eyes or her accomplishments, or any of the pretty lies men told when they wanted something from a woman. "Miss Blackwood," it began, as blunt as a blade, "I am told you possess an unusual aptitude for mathematics and estate management. I am told you read Latin and keep your father's account books when his steward proves incompetent. I am told also that you are considered unmarriageable by London standards, though I confess I cannot fathom why intelligence should be deemed a defect." Adeline had blinked at that, her heart doing something strange in her chest. "I am in need of a wife," the letter continued, "though not for the reasons most men seek matrimony. I do not require an ornament for my drawing-room or a docile companion for my bed. I require a woman with the heaviness of mind to manage a duchy that spans 3 counties and employs over 400 souls. My previous steward embezzled £40,000 before hanging himself in the East Stable. My accounts are a disaster, my tenants are on the verge of revolt, my political enemies circle like wolves, waiting for the estate to collapse so they can carve up the holdings among themselves." The handwriting had grown sharper here, as though he'd pressed the pen harder into the paper. "I need someone who can see through lies, balance impossible ledgers, and make hard decisions without dissolving into hysterics. I need someone the London Ton has already dismissed, someone who has nothing to lose and everything to prove. In exchange, I offer you a title that will make every person who ever sneered at you curtsy until their knees crack. I offer you autonomy, purpose, and a household that will answer to you as its mistress. I offer you power." He had signed it simply Nicholas Hargrave, Grand Duke of Oakhaven, with a postscript that had made her laugh despite herself. "I am not handsome, I am not charming, and I have been called the Dark Duke by society papers, who cannot forgive me for preferring my library to their ballrooms. If you require romance, look elsewhere. If you require respect and a fair contract, respond within the week." Adeline had tucked the letter away, telling herself it was madness. Grand dukes did not propose to barons' daughters they'd never met. Men did not offer power to women society had deemed too substantial, too opinionated, too much. It had to be some kind of cruel joke, perhaps orchestrated by one of her mother's friends who thought it amusing to give a wallflower false hope. But the seal had been real. The address, Oakhaven Manor, Derbyshire, was real, and when she'd quietly asked her father's man of business about the Duke of Oakhaven, he'd gone pale and said, "Stay away from that one, miss. He's got more power than sense, and a temper like a winter storm. They say he drove his last steward to suicide with his demands," which meant he was real, which meant the offer was real. Adeline had pushed the letter to the bottom of her correspondence pile and tried to forget about it. She had still believed then in the possibility of Lord Charles. She had still thought she might find a place in London society if she just tried harder, just shrunk herself a little more. That was before Almack's, before prize heifer, before she'd stood behind the roses and felt her heart freeze into something hard and unbreakable. Now, standing in her bedchamber, with her mother still staring at the ruins of the rose silk gown, Adeline held the Duke's letter like a lifeline. Her hands didn't shake as she broke the black seal again, reading the words with new eyes. Power, autonomy, a title that will make every person who ever sneered at you curtsy until their knees crack. Yes, she thought, yes to all of it. She sat at her writing desk, pulled out a fresh sheet of paper, and dipped her pen in ink. Her mother had started to speak behind her, some protest or threat or plea, but Adeline didn't hear it. She was already gone, already riding north to Derbyshire, already standing in a library that needed her mind more than London needed her to disappear. "Your Grace," she wrote, her script neat and unflinching, "I accept your proposal. When should I expect the carriage?" The carriage arrived at midnight, black as a judge's robes and twice as forbidding. Adeline watched it from her bedroom window, her travelling trunk already packed and waiting by the door. She had told no one except her lady's maid, who had helped her dress in the dark and then pressed a small cloth bundle of food into her hands, with tears streaming down her face. "You're sure about this, miss?" Sarah had whispered, her voice breaking. "They say he's a monster. They say Oakhaven is cursed, that his first wife—" "He's never been married," Adeline had corrected quietly, fastening her cloak, "and I'd rather face a monster who wants my mind than stay in a city that wants me invisible." The coachman who knocked on the servants' entrance was nearly 7 feet tall, with a face like weathered granite. He didn't bow, didn't smile, simply took her trunk as though it weighed nothing, and jerked his head toward the waiting carriage. Adeline followed him through the garden, her half-boots crunching on gravel, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. She didn't look back at Blackwood House. There was nothing there she wanted to remember. The carriage interior smelled of leather and something sharp, tobacco maybe, or the particular scent of old money and older power. The seats were upholstered in midnight blue velvet, and there was a lap blanket of fur that Adeline pulled around herself as the wheels began to turn. London slipped past the window in shadows and gaslight, the city that had tried to compress her into something acceptable finally fading into the dark. They were nearly to the city limits when the coachman rapped on the roof and slowed. Adeline's stomach clenched. Had her mother discovered her absence? Had she sent constables to drag her back? But it was worse than constables. A rider approached from the side of the road, his horse gleaming pale in the moonlight, his golden hair unmistakable even in the dark. Lord Charles Stanhope drew alongside the carriage, and Adeline saw him peer through the window, his face urgent and concerned in a way that made her want to laugh or scream or both. The coachman looked back at her through the small opening. "My lady, do you know this gentleman?" The title, "My Lady," sent a shock through her. She wasn't a lady yet, wouldn't be until the marriage, but the Duke's servants already treated her as though the transformation was complete, as though she was already beyond the reach of men like Charles Stanhope. "No," she said clearly, "I don't know him. Drive on." But Charles was already dismounting, already approaching the carriage door with a folded note in his hand. The coachman moved to intercept him, one massive hand settling on Charles's shoulder in what was clearly not a friendly gesture, but Charles shook him off. "Adeline," he called, his voice carrying that same charm that had once made her foolish heart flutter. "Adeline, please, I need to speak with you. I need to explain about last night." She could have stayed silent, could have let the coachman handle him, but something vicious and new-born in her chest wanted him to see her face when she refused him. She leaned forward into the window's light, letting him see her clearly, letting him see that she was dressed for travel, that she was leaving, that she was already gone. "There's nothing to explain, my lord," she said, her voice cold and precise. "I heard you perfectly well at Almack's. You compared me to livestock and declared me unfit for marriage. I have no interest in whatever apologies or explanations you've prepared." His face went white, then red. "You heard, Adeline, I was drunk. I was trying to impress. It was a jest. Surely you know I didn't mean—" "You meant every word," she said flatly, "and I'm grateful for your honesty. It's clarified certain matters considerably." "But where are you going?" He looked genuinely panicked now, his eyes darting from her face to the ducal crest emblazoned on the carriage door. "Whose carriage is this? Adeline, you can't just leave in the middle of the night with—" "I'm going to Derbyshire," she interrupted, and felt a fierce, wild joy at the shock that crossed his face. "I'm going to marry the Grand Duke of Oakhaven. I'm going to become a duchess, and you, Lord Charles, are going to return to London and explain to everyone how the woman who was too fat to marry is now beyond your reach entirely." She rapped on the roof before he could respond. The coachman climbed back to his seat with visible satisfaction, and the carriage lurched forward. Charles stood in the road behind them, still holding his pathetic note, growing smaller and smaller until the darkness swallowed him completely. Adeline settled back against the velvet seats, her hands shaking now that it was over, her breath coming in sharp gasps that might have been sobs or laughter. She had done it. She had actually done it. She had looked the man who humiliated her in the face and left him standing in the dirt while she rode towards something bigger, something that needed her exactly as she was. The road to Derbyshire stretched out ahead, dark and uncertain and full of possibility. Adeline closed her eyes and didn't sleep, but somewhere in the rhythmic rocking of the carriage she felt the ice around her heart begin to shift into something harder, something sharper, something that could cut.
Oakhaven appeared on the third dawn like something from a Gothic novel, all limestone towers and ancient oaks perched on cliffs that dropped sheer into the North Sea. The house was massive, sprawling, and clearly designed to intimidate. Adeline loved it immediately. The Duke himself met her in the entrance hall, and if she had expected some transformation from the cold formality of his letter, she was disappointed. Nicholas Hargrave was tall and dark-haired, with a face that looked like it had forgotten how to smile sometime in the last decade. He wore black from collar to boots, and his eyes were the color of a winter storm, grey and assessing, and utterly without warmth. "Miss Blackwood," he said, not offering his hand, "you came." She was too tired from 3 days of travel to manage courtesy. Her back ached, her head pounded, and she desperately wanted a bath and 12 hours of sleep. Most women would have reconsidered. His gaze swept over her once, clinical and detached, as though she were a horse he was considering purchasing. "Are you prepared to marry a stranger and manage an estate you've never seen? Are you prepared to trust a woman you've never met with your accounts and your reputation?" she countered. Something that might have been amusement flickered across his face, drawn so quickly she might have imagined it. "We'll marry tomorrow morning. The bishop is already here. After that, you'll have full access to the estate records. I suggest you begin with the ledgers from the past 5 years. That's when the bleeding started." The wedding was performed in the private chapel at dawn, witnessed by the housekeeper and the bishop, both of whom looked at Adeline with varying degrees of pity and confusion. The ceremony took less than 10 minutes. Nicholas slid a heavy gold ring onto her finger, medieval probably, with a raven carved in the band, and kissed her cheek with all the passion of a man signing a business contract. Then he walked her directly to the estate office and unlocked a cabinet containing 12 massive ledger books. "Everything is in here," he said, "or should be. My steward, Pemberton, kept meticulous records until the day he didn't. He hanged himself in the stables 6 weeks ago. His assistant, Crawford, has been managing things since, but the numbers haven't improved. If anything, they've gotten worse." Adeline pulled out the most recent ledger, flipping it open to see neat columns of expenses and income, all properly dated and categorized. On the surface it looked perfectly normal, but her father had taught her to read accounts the way a doctor reads symptoms, looking for the patterns beneath the surface, the small inconsistencies that revealed the larger disease. "Leave me," she said absently, already tracing a finger down the columns, "and send for whoever has been doing the purchasing for the household. I want to speak with them by noon." Nicholas left without argument, and Adeline lost herself in numbers. The first discrepancy appeared within an hour. The estate was purchasing grain at 15 shillings per bushel, when the market rate was 9.
The coal was coming in at nearly double the standard price. The monthly wages for household staff had mysteriously increased by 30% over the past year, though no new servants had been hired. She worked through the morning and into the afternoon, building a picture of systematic theft so elegant it was almost beautiful. Pemberton hadn't stolen in obvious chunks. He'd added pennies here, shillings there, spreading the theft across dozens of small transactions that individually looked reasonable, but together amounted to thousands of pounds per year. And he'd been careful, almost careful enough. But he'd made one mistake. He'd used the same supplier for nearly everything, a merchant company called Hartwell and Sons that appeared over and over in the ledgers. Grain, coal, fabric, wine, candles, all purchased from Hartwell and Sons at inflated prices. When Crawford, the assistant steward, arrived at noon, Adeline looked up from the ledgers with eyes that felt gritty from lack of sleep.
"Tell me about Hartwell and Sons," she said without preamble. Crawford was a thin man in his 40s, with nervous hands and a habit of not meeting her eyes. "Reputable firm, Your Grace. Mr. Pemberton worked with them for years. Very reliable." "And do they exist?" The colour drained from Crawford's face. Your Grace, I don't understand." "It's a simple question, Mr. Crawford. Does Hartwell and Sons actually exist, or is it a fiction Pemberton created to funnel money into his own pockets?" She stood, moving around the desk to stand directly in front of him. "And more importantly, are you continuing the scheme now that Pemberton is dead?" "I would never. Your Grace, I had no idea." "You're the assistant steward," Adeline said coldly. "You countersigned every one of these purchases. You expect me to believe you didn't notice we were paying double for everything?" Crawford's mouth opened and closed like a fish drowning in air. Finally, he whispered, "He said you'd never look. He said duchesses don't concern themselves with household accounts. He said he was wrong, and so were you for believing him. You're dismissed. Collect your things and be gone by sunset. If I find you've taken so much as a candlestick, I'll have you prosecuted." She turned back to the ledgers, dismissing him from her attention entirely. Behind her, Crawford made a small choked sound and fled. Nicholas appeared in the doorway minutes later, his expression unreadable. "The entire household is gossiping that you've already sacked Crawford." Crawford was embezzling, or at minimum helping Pemberton embezzle. "I'll need a new steward, someone from outside the county who has no connection to the previous regime, and I'll need access to the tenant rolls and the account books for every supplier. This theft goes deeper than 2 corrupt stewards." "How much?" Nicholas asked quietly. "Conservatively £60,000 over 5 years, possibly more once I ordered the capital improvements." She looked up at him, seeing something shift in those grey eyes. "Your estate isn't failing, Your Grace. It's being murdered, but it can be saved." He crossed the room in 3 strides and did something she didn't expect. He took her hand, the one wearing his ancestral ring, and raised it briefly to his lips. "You'll have everything you need, and anyone who stands in your way will answer to me." It wasn't love, it wasn't even affection, but it was respect and partnership and the acknowledgement that she was exactly what he'd needed. For now, that was enough. 3 months into their marriage, Adeline presented Nicholas with a document that would change everything. She found him in his study at twilight, standing by the window with a glass of whiskey, staring out at the cliffs as though they held answers to questions he hadn't asked. He'd been doing that more often lately, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher whenever he thought she wasn't looking. "I have the final accounting," she said, setting the leather portfolio on his desk. Her hands were stained with ink, her day dress rumpled from 14 hours bent over ledgers. She knew she looked a mess. She'd stopped caring what she looked like weeks ago, somewhere between discovering the fraudulent grain contracts and firing the 3rd corrupt supplier. Nicholas turned from the window, his face unreadable as always. "And?" "The estate was losing approximately £12,000 per year through systematic fraud," she said, flipping open the portfolio to reveal neat columns of figures. "Pemberton and Crawford were the architects, but they had help. The head groom was selling your horses and replacing them with inferior stock.
The cook was taking kickbacks from suppliers. Even the gamekeeper was poaching your own deer and selling them to London markets. She watched his jaw tighten, the only sign of emotion he ever allowed himself. I've dismissed all of them and hired replacements from Yorkshire, people with no connection to the previous regime. I've also renegotiated every supplier contract and found new vendors who are charging fair market rates. The estate is now operating at a profit of £8,000 per year. Nicholas moved closer to the desk, his eyes scanning the numbers with the intensity of a man reading a battle report. That's a turnaround of £20,000 annually. More, actually. I have also discovered that you own mineral rights to a limestone quarry on the northern boundary that's been sitting dormant for 15 years. The previous steward told you it was exhausted, but I had a surveyor examine it. It's not only viable, it's one of the richest deposits in Derbyshire. If we lease the rights to the new railway company, that's another £6,000 per year in revenue. She pulled out another document, this one thick with legal language and official seals. I've already drafted the contract. They're offering 10-year terms with an option to renew. All you need to do is sign. Nicholas stared at the contract, then at her, then back at the contract. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. You found a quarry no one else knew existed. Someone knew, Adeline corrected. Pemberton knew. He was planning to buy the land through a proxy after bankrupting you. I found the correspondence in his private papers. He was going to steal your estate piece by piece and make himself rich in the process. The silence that followed was electric. Nicholas set down his whiskey glass with deliberate care, as though if he moved too quickly he might shatter something. Then he did something Adeline had never seen him do in 3 months of marriage. He laughed. It was a dark, bitter sound, but it was genuine. I brought you here because I needed competence, he said. I needed someone who could balance ledgers and manage servants and keep the estate from collapsing. That's what I asked for in my letter, a business arrangement. Yes, Adeline said, carefully, uncertain where this was going. But you didn't just manage the estate. He moved around the desk, closing the distance between them, until he was standing directly in front of her, closer than he'd ever stood since that perfunctory kiss in the chapel. You saved it. You uncovered a conspiracy that would have destroyed everything my family built over 6 generations. You turned a failing estate into a profitable one. You've done in 3 months what I couldn't do in 3 years. Adeline felt her heart begin to pound. She'd grown accustomed to his distance, his cold formality, the way he treated her like a valued employee rather than a wife. This proximity, this intensity in his grey eyes, was entirely new. I did what you hired me to do, she said, but her voice came out softer than she intended. No. He reached up, and she froze as his fingers brushed her cheek, tilting her face toward the lamplight. You did far more than that, and I've been so focused on the estate, so consumed with keeping everything from falling apart, that I failed to see what was right in front of me. Which is, that I married a woman who is extraordinary. His thumb traced along her jawline, his touch gentle in a way that made her breath catch. Not in spite of what London rejected, but because of it. They called you too much, too substantial, too intelligent, too opinionated. But there's no such thing as too much when you're building something that needs to last. Empires aren't built by delicate flowers. They're built by women like you. Adeline's eyes stung. She blinked hard, refusing to cry, but something was cracking open in her chest. You're only saying that because I saved your money. I'm saying it because it's true. His other hand came up to frame her face, forcing her to meet his eyes. Look at me, Adeline. Really look. She did, and for the first time she saw past the cold exterior to something burning underneath. Admiration, respect, and something else, something that made her knees weak. I see you, he said quietly, not the woman London tried to compress into nothing. I see the woman who ripped apart a silk gown rather than shrink herself one more inch, the woman who left everything familiar to marry a stranger because she knew her worth, the woman who has more courage and brilliance in her smallest finger than every insipid debutante in London combined. He leaned forward, his forehead resting against hers, his breath warm on her lips. I see a queen, and I've been a fool not to tell you sooner. When he kissed her, it wasn't perfunctory or cold or dutiful. It was claiming and grateful and absolutely real. Adeline kissed him back, her ink-stained hands fisting in his shirt. 3 months of loneliness and determination and fierce private victory pouring into that single moment of connection. When they finally broke apart, Nicholas kept his hands on her face, his grey eyes searching hers, those emerald eyes that London had declared pretty but wasted on a body like hers. I think, he said slowly, that I may have gotten far more than I bargained for when I sent that letter. Adeline smiled, real and unguarded. Good, because I'm not finished yet. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered with the regular post, but immediately recognizable by its lavender scent and the ostentatious wax seal. Adeline was in the estate office reviewing tenant petitions when Mrs. Dalton, the housekeeper, brought it in on a silver tray with an expression of deep disapproval. "This came for you, Your Grace, from London." The way she said London made it sound like a disease. Adeline recognized the handwriting before she even broke the seal. Lady Henrietta Vane had the same elaborate, swooping script that all fashionable young women cultivated, designed to look effortless while actually requiring painstaking effort. She'd seen it on a dozen invitations during her failed London season, always accompanied by smug little notes about how delightful it would be to see her again. She opened it because curiosity was one vice she'd never managed to suppress. "My dearest Adeline," it began, and the false sweetness made her teeth ache. "I hope this letter finds you well in your northern exile. We were all so shocked to hear of your sudden marriage to the Grand Duke, though I suppose when one is desperate, one cannot afford to be choosy about location or temperament. Lord Charles has been absolutely beside himself, claiming you misunderstood some silly jest at Almack's. Men can be so careless with their words, can't they?" Adeline's grip tightened on the paper. "I do hope you're finding happiness in Derbyshire. I'm sure the country air agrees with you, and there must be a certain comfort in being somewhere no one knows your history. London has been divine without all the drama of last season. Charles and I have been seen together quite often at the theatre and various balls. Everyone says we make the most handsome couple." The letter continued in that vein for another paragraph, each sentence a carefully placed needle designed to remind Adeline of everything she'd lost, everything she'd fled from, everything she was supposed to feel ashamed about. Henrietta signed it, "Your devoted friend," with 3 underlines, as though emphasis could make the lie more convincing. Adeline read it twice, her face expressionless. Then she stood, walked to the fireplace, and held the lavender-scented paper to the flames. The expensive stationery caught immediately, curling and blackening, Henrietta's poisonous words dissolving into ash and smoke. She watched it burn completely before turning to Mrs. Dalton, who was still standing in the doorway with her arms crossed. "Send word to the modiste in York," Adeline said. "I'll need an entire wardrobe suitable for London society. Nothing in pastel. I want jewel tones, emerald, sapphire, deep ruby. And I want every gown cut to fit my actual body, not the body they wish I had. No corseting beyond what's necessary for support." Mrs. Dalton's eyebrows rose. "You're going back to London, Your Grace?" "Eventually," Adeline returned to her desk, already composing a list in her mind. "But not as Miss Adeline Blackwood, the desperate wallflower who fled in the night. I'll return as the Grand Duchess of Oakhaven, wife to one of the most powerful men in England, manager of an estate that's now the talk of every gentleman's club in the north." She picked up her pen, tapping it against her lips thoughtfully. Also, send inquiries to our solicitors. I want to know which members of the ton owe money to which banks, who's overextended on their estates, who's gambling beyond their means, who's one bad harvest away from ruin. Knowledge is currency, Mrs. Dalton, and I intend to be very, very wealthy." The housekeeper's stern face cracked into something that might have been a smile. "Should I inform His Grace of your plans? Nicholas already knows." Adeline had told him last night, lying in the darkness of their shared bedroom, still a new development, one that made her heart race every time she thought about it. "He's the one who suggested we host a ball at our London residence next season, something appropriately grand, something everyone will attend because refusing would be social suicide. And Lady Henrietta Vane will receive an invitation, naturally. It would be rude to not invite such a devoted friend." Adeline's sharp smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "I want her there. I want her to see exactly what she helped create when she laughed at me behind her fan. I want Charles there, too, watching his most handsome couple fantasy crumble while I stand next to a Grand Duke who actually values what I am." She pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began writing, her script neat and deliberate. Not a response to Henrietta. That would suggest the letter had mattered, had landed its intended blow. Instead, she wrote to the Duchess of Pemberton, a woman known for hosting the most exclusive gatherings in London, a woman whose good opinion could make or break a reputation. "Your Grace," she wrote, "I hope this letter finds you well. My husband and I are planning to open Oakhaven House for the season, and would be honored if you would attend our inaugural ball. I understand you have an interest in estate management and agricultural reform, topics which I believe we could discuss at length, along with certain observations I've made about the importance of surrounding oneself with genuine allies rather than false friends." It was a gamble. The Duchess of Pemberton was notoriously difficult to impress, and had a reputation for seeing through social pretense like glass. But Adeline had done her research. The Duchess of Pemberton had lost her own husband's estate to corrupt stewards years ago, and spent a decade rebuilding it through sheer determination. She would understand what Adeline had accomplished. She would recognize a kindred spirit. And once the Duchess of Pemberton endorsed the Grand Duchess of Oakhaven, the rest of London would fall in line like dominoes. Adeline sealed the letter with her new ducal seal, the raven and oak leaves that now represented her authority, and set it aside for the Morning Post. Then she returned to the tenant petitions, a small smile playing at her lips. Henrietta thought she'd won by capturing Charles's attention. Poor, foolish Henrietta. She had no idea the hunt had only begun.
The attack came on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after Adeline had fired the last of Pemberton's Confederates. She was walking the western boundary of the estate with Nicholas, discussing plans to expand the tenant cottages, when the first shot rang out. The bullet hit the oak tree beside her head with a crack that sent bark exploding into her hair. Nicholas moved faster than she'd ever seen him move, tackling her to the ground and covering her body with his own as a second shot whistled overhead. The impact drove the air from her lungs, left her gasping against the cold earth with Nicholas's weight pressing her down and his heart hammering against her spine. "Stay down," he growled, his voice rough with something that might have been fear or fury or both. Then he was rolling off her, somehow producing a pistol from inside his coat, his grey eyes gone flat and deadly as he scanned the tree line. Adeline's mind raced even as she pressed herself into the dirt. The shots had come from the copse of birch trees to the north, maybe 60 yards away. Too far for a casual poacher, too accurate to be accidental. Someone had been waiting for them. Someone had planned this. "Crawford," she breathed, even as Nicholas fired a shot toward the birches. "Or someone he hired. I should have had him arrested, not just dismissed." "Quiet." Nicholas's hand found hers, squeezing once, hard. "Can you run?" "Yes." "When I say go, you run for those rocks." He pointed to an outcropping 20 yards behind them. "Don't stop, don't look back. Understand?"
Before she could answer, he stood abruptly, firing twice more at the tree line, drawing the shooter's attention. Adeline saw the flash of return fire and heard Nicholas curse as he dove sideways. Then his voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "Go!" She ran. Her skirts tangled around her legs, her boots slipped on wet grass, but she ran like her life depended on it, because it did. Another shot cracked behind her, and she heard the bullet impact somewhere to her left, too close, far too close. Then she was behind the rocks, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her hands shaking as she pressed herself against cold stone. Nicholas appeared seconds later, sliding in beside her with blood running down his left arm. Adeline's heart stopped. "You're hit!" Grazed. He was already reloading his pistol with practiced efficiency, his face set in lines of cold fury. "Nothing serious, but whoever that is, they're not leaving this forest alive." "Nicholas, we should wait for help." "They tried to kill my wife." His voice was absolutely glacial. "They don't get to walk away from that." He rose slightly, peering over the rocks. "There's only one of them. Amateur. Professional assassin wouldn't have missed the first shot." His eyes narrowed. "He's running, heading north toward the road." Before Adeline could stop him, Nicholas vaulted over the rocks and sprinted toward the tree line. She watched in horror as he disappeared into the birches, heard shouting, the sound of breaking branches, then a single gunshot that made her heart seize in her chest. The silence that followed was unbearable. Then Nicholas emerged from the trees, dragging a man by the collar. Even from a distance, Adeline recognized him, Thomas Hartwell, the supposed merchant whose company had been funneling money from Pemberton's fraud, the man who'd disappeared the day after Adeline had exposed the scheme. Nicholas threw Hartwell down in the clearing like a sack of grain. The man's face was bloodied, his fine coat torn, and he was clutching his thigh, where blood seeped between his fingers. "He was going to kill you," Nicholas said flatly as Adeline approached, "because you cost him £60,000 in stolen money." Hartwell spat blood. She destroyed everything, years of careful work gone, because some fat bitch thought she could play at being clever. He didn't finish the sentence. Nicholas's fist connected with his jaw with a crack that echoed across the valley. Hartwell crumpled, unconscious before he hit the ground. Nicholas stood over him, breathing hard, his knuckles split and bleeding, his grey eyes still burning with protective rage. When he turned to Adeline, she saw something in his face that made her chest ache, fear for her, fury at the threat, and underneath it all, something fierce and possessive that went far beyond their business arrangement. If he'd succeeded, his voice broke, if that first shot had been 2 inches to the right, Adeline closed the distance between them and took his bloodied hand in hers. "But it wasn't. I'm fine. We're both fine." "He called you." Nicholas's jaw clenched. "He has no right to speak of you that way. No one does." "Words can't hurt me anymore." She squeezed his hand. "I've been called worse by better people. What matters is that you were here. You protected me." Nicholas pulled her against his chest suddenly, fiercely, his arms wrapping around her with an intensity that stole her breath. She felt him shaking, felt the terror he'd been holding back now that the danger had passed. "I would burn down empires for you," he said against her hair. "You understand that? Anyone who threatens you threatens everything I value, and I do not forgive threats." Adeline pulled back just enough to see his face, this man who'd offered her a business arrangement and somehow become something infinitely more valuable. "Then we're matched," she said quietly, "because I would do the same for you." He kissed her then, hard and desperate and claiming, tasting of smoke and fear and absolute devotion. When they broke apart, Hartwell was still unconscious at their feet, and somewhere in the distance, estate workers were running to the sound of gunfire. But in that moment, standing in the middle of a battlefield with blood on their hands and fury in their hearts, Adeline and Nicholas were never more perfectly aligned. They were not a love match. They were something far more dangerous. They were partners, equals, an empire of two that would crush anyone foolish enough to stand in their way. The Grand Duchess of Oakhaven arrived in London on the first day of the season, and the city held its breath. Adeline stepped from the ducal carriage at precisely 3 in the afternoon, the hour when Hyde Park would be at its most crowded, when every person of consequence would be parading through Rotten Row to see and be seen. She had timed it perfectly. Nicholas had taught her that power was as much about presentation as substance, and today she intended to present something London had never seen before. The gown was deep emerald velvet, the exact shade of her eyes, cut in a style that would have made her mother faint. There was no attempt to create the fashionable straight silhouette, no compression of her natural curves into something more palatable. Instead, the bodice was fitted to her actual body, emphasizing the fullness of her breasts and the indent of her waist before flowing into a skirt that moved like liquid wealth. The neckline was cut low enough to be daring but not scandalous, and the sleeves were trimmed with gold embroidery that caught the spring sunlight. She wore no corset beyond the lightest boning for support. For the first time in her adult life, she could breathe fully, deeply, without the constant pressure of whalebone trying to reshape her into something she was not. The ducal coronet rested on her dark hair, which her lady's maid had arranged in an elaborate style that had taken 2 hours and approximately 1,000 pins. Emeralds hung at her throat and wrists, not delicate little stones, but substantial gems that announced she was beyond the reach of anyone's opinion. On her hand, Nicholas's ancestral ring caught the light like a declaration of war. Nicholas himself walked beside her, devastating in black superfine and silver brocade, his expression as cold and forbidding as always. But his hand rested possessively at the small of her back, and everyone who saw them would understand exactly what that touch meant. They were spotted within seconds. Adeline watched the ripple of recognition move through the crowd like a stone dropped in still water. Heads turned, conversation stopped. Women grabbed their companions' arms and pointed with their fans, whispering frantically behind gloved hands. She kept her chin high and her expression serene as they walked deeper into the park. Around them, the whispers grew louder, less discreet. "Is that Adeline Blackwood? It can't be. She left in disgrace. But that's the Grand Duke of Oakhaven. Good God, she married him. Look at that gown. She's not even wearing proper stays. How dare she show her face hereafter?" The voices cut off abruptly as Nicholas stopped walking and turned to face them, his grey eyes sweeping across the crowd with the kind of disdain that could flay skin from bone. The silence that followed was absolute. Then the Duchess of Pemberton stepped forward from the crowd, her sharp eyes taking in Adeline's appearance with a single assessing glance. She was 70 if she was a day, with a spine like iron and a reputation for suffering neither fools nor false sentiment. When she smiled, it was like watching winter crack into spring. "Your Grace," she said, addressing Adeline with a curtsy that was respectful but not subservient. "How delightful to see you in London. I received your letter about estate management and found your observations on agricultural reform absolutely fascinating. We must discuss them further at length." It was an endorsement, a public, unmistakable endorsement from the most influential woman in London society. Adeline curtsied in return, the movement graceful despite her unconventional silhouette. "Your Grace, the pleasure is entirely mine. I've long admired your work restoring the Pemberton estates. It's rare to find someone who understands that running a duchy requires more than decorative accomplishments." The Duchess's smile sharpened. "Indeed, I find the most valuable women are the ones society initially overlooks. They tend to develop actual competence instead of relying on pretty manners." Around them, the crowd was fracturing into factions. Some looked scandalized, others intrigued, a few openly calculating the shift in social dynamics. Adeline could feel the weight of their stares, the assessment, the judgment. 6 months ago it would have crushed her. Now it felt like standing in a strong wind, present but ultimately irrelevant. Then she saw them, Lord Charles Stanhope and Lady Henrietta Vane, frozen on the path ahead, like deer who'd just spotted the hunters. Charles had gone pale beneath his golden tan, his mouth slightly open in what might have been shock or horror. Henrietta's expression was harder to read, a mix of fury and disbelief that she was trying desperately to mask behind a brittle smile. Adeline felt Nicholas's hand press more firmly against her back, support, solidarity, silent permission to do whatever she needed to do next. She could have walked past them, could have ignored them entirely, dismissed them with the kind of cutting indifference that Nicholas wielded like a blade, but that would suggest they still had the power to hurt her, that their opinions still mattered. Instead, she smiled, not the tight, anxious smile of Miss Adeline Blackwood, trying desperately to please. This was the woman who'd saved a duchy, survived an assassination attempt, and discovered exactly how much power she could wield when she stopped apologizing for existing. "Lord Charles," she said pleasantly, as though they were old friends meeting for tea. "Lady Henrietta, how lovely to see you both. I trust you received our invitation to the ball at Oakhaven House next week. It promises to be quite the event. Everyone who matters will be attending." She let the implication hang in the air. Everyone who matters. The question of whether Charles and Henrietta fell into that category was deliberately, devastatingly ambiguous. Charles opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. No words came out. Henrietta recovered faster, her smile turning venomous. "How kind of you to think of us, Your Grace, though I must say London has been perfectly delightful without the drama of desperate wallflowers and cruel jests," Adeline interrupted gently. "Yes, I imagine it has been much quieter, though quiet and significant are rarely the same thing, don't you find?" She didn't wait for a response. She simply inclined her head in gracious dismissal and continued walking, Nicholas beside her, the Duchess of Pemberton falling into step on her other side like a general claiming an ally. Behind them, the whispers erupted like wildfire. The Grand Duchess of Oakhaven had returned to London, and she was magnificent. The ball at Oakhaven House was everything Adeline had promised it would be, a calculated display of power wrapped in silk and candlelight. The London residence had been closed for years, but she'd brought it back to life with ruthless efficiency. Crystal chandeliers blazed overhead, champagne flowed like water, and every person of consequence in England had accepted their invitation because refusing would have been social suicide. Adeline stood at the top of the grand staircase in midnight blue velvet, sewn with silver stars, Nicholas beside her, in formal court dress, as they received their guests. She watched them file past, these people who had once made her feel small, and felt nothing but a distant satisfaction. The Duchess of Pemberton had arrived early and immediately claimed a position near the refreshment tables, holding court like a general surveying a battlefield. Lord and Lady Ashford, who had once excluded Adeline from their country party, bowed so low she could see the bald spot on Lord Ashford's crown. Even the patronesses of Almack's had come, their expressions carefully neutral, as they curtsied to the woman they'd once dismissed as unmarriageable. Charles appeared halfway through the receiving line, Henrietta conspicuously absent from his side. He looked thinner than Adeline remembered, his golden hair less lustrous, his smile strained. When he reached them, he bowed with exaggerated formality. "Your Grace," he said to Nicholas, then turned to Adeline. "Your Grace, thank you for the invitation. I wonder if I might have a word." "The dancing will begin shortly," Adeline said pleasantly, as though he hadn't spoken. "Do enjoy the champagne, Lord Charles. It's from the Duke's private reserve." She made to turn away, but Charles's hand shot out, not quite touching her arm, but close enough to be presumptuous. "Adeline, Your Grace, please, I need to speak with you, to explain about that night at Almack's. I was drunk, I was foolish, I said things I didn't mean. You said exactly what you meant." Her voice was calm, almost kind. "You compared me to livestock. You declared me too fat to marry. You did it to impress another woman, and you laughed when your friends joined in." Charles's face flushed red. Around them the receiving line had gone very quiet, guests straining to hear without appearing to eavesdrop. "I was wrong. I've regretted it every day since. I've come to apologize and to ask, that is, I hoped we might—" You hoped the Grand Duchess might forgive you, Nicholas said, his voice cutting through Charles's stammering like a knife through silk. He stepped forward, positioning himself slightly between Adeline and Charles, his grey eyes colder than she'd ever seen them. You hoped that forgiveness might come with access to my political connections, my financial backing, perhaps a position in my household?
Charles went pale. Your Grace, I simply wanted to make amends. You wanted to use my wife's kindness to salvage your failing prospects. Nicholas looked Charles up and down with the kind of disdain usually reserved for something found on the bottom of a boot. I've made inquiries about you, Stanhope. Your estate is mortgaged to the hilt. Your gambling debts exceed £15,000. Your father has threatened to cut you off entirely unless you make an advantageous match, and Lady Henrietta Vane has recently become significantly less interested in your company now that everyone knows you're nearly bankrupt. The colour drained completely from Charles's face. Behind them someone gasped. Nicholas continued, relentless. So you thought you'd apologize to the woman you publicly humiliated, hoping she'd be so desperate for your approval that she'd convince me to throw you a lifeline. That about sum it up? Your Grace, please. My wife is a Grand Duchess, Nicholas said, his voice dropping to something quiet and infinitely more dangerous. She manages a duchy that generates more wealth in a year than your family has seen in a generation. She saved my estate from collapse, survived an assassination attempt without flinching, and earned the respect of every person of substance in this room. You, Lord Charles, are a footnote, a cautionary tale about the consequences of cruelty and poor judgment. He leaned in closer, his voice pitched for Charles's ears alone, though Adeline heard every word. If you ever speak to my wife again, if you ever approach her, if you ever so much as look in her direction, I will personally ensure that every door in London closes to you. Every club, every drawing room, every marriageable woman with a decent dowry will know exactly what kind of man you are. Am I clear? Charles nodded jerkily, his face a mask of humiliation. Good. Nicholas straightened, his expression returning to his usual cold neutrality. Now, be gone. Charles fled. There was no other word for it. He turned and pushed through the crowd of guests, his shoulders hunched, his face burning with shame. The whispers started immediately, spreading through the ballroom like flames through dry timber. Nicholas turned to Adeline, offering his arm. "Shall we open the dancing, my dear?" Adeline took his arm, her heart so full she could barely speak. "That was entirely unnecessary," she said quietly as he led her toward the ballroom floor. "It was completely necessary," he corrected. "He needed to understand that you're not the woman he rejected. You're the woman who's far too valuable for him to have ever deserved." The orchestra began to play, and Nicholas swept her into the waltz. Around them the entire ballroom watched, but for once Adeline didn't care about their stares or their whispers or their judgments. She was dancing with her husband, her partner, her equal, and she had never been more free.
Our time together is ending, but the scandal doesn't have to. If your heart is still racing, don't let it die here. The two stories on your screen are darker, deeper, and even more irresistible. Subscribe so we don't lose each other. Then click one now. Your next obsession is waiting.